Hello and welcome to Series 4 of the Public Interest Technology PIT Colloquium. We are delighted to be hosting this series and have an engaging program lined up. My name is Roba Abbas and I am a Senior Lecturer in the School of Business at the University of Wollongong, Australia, and the Socio-Technical Systems Technical Committee's Chair at the IEEE. I'm joined today by my co-host, Professor Katina Michael, who is the Director of the Society Policy Engineering Collective in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University, and is also the Editor-in-Chief of the IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society. Katina and I would like to acknowledge the events team at the College of Global Futures at ASU for their support of this series. Before we introduce our distinguished speaker for this session, I would like to take a moment to reflect on our colloquium to date. We journeyed from Series 1, which focused on values, responsible innovation, and COVID-specific technological responses, to Series 2, which centered on storytelling, imagination, and participatory design methodologies, and on to Series 3, which emphasized the global perspective with respect to the social, the regulatory, and the ethical considerations relevant to the design, development, and delivery of technology in the public interest. In this series, we illuminate a path toward transdisciplinarity, hosting international speakers who will share with us their perspectives on topics such as experts and expertise, innovation ecosystems, multi-stakeholder approaches, and the opportunities and challenges relating to addressing complex societal challenges. In this session, we'll be hosting Professor Elias Carayannis to deliver a second presentation following on from his initial talk in this series, which was titled Democracy, Environment and Technology, Interactions, Interdependencies and Implications for Theory, Policy, Practice and Politics, which was a rich and nuanced presentation that required a follow-up. During this session and for our live attendees, our order of events is as follows. We'll first be hearing from Professor Carayannis, after which, and time permitting, we'll be engaging in reflections and questions as well as a discourse before our closing remarks. So please feel free to use the chat function during the presentation and during this session to reflect, to share your questions, or to indicate that you wish to speak post-presentation. We are delighted to welcome and introduce Professor Carayannis, our speaker for today. Dr. Elias Carayannis is a full professor of science, technology, innovation and entrepreneurship, as well as the co-founder and co-director of the Global and Entrepreneurial Finance Research Institute and director of the European Union Research Center at the School of Business at George Washington University in Washington, DC. Dr. Carayannis' teaching and research activities focus on strategic government, university, industry R&D partnerships, technology road mapping, technology transfer and commercialization, as well as international science and technology policy, technological entrepreneurship, and regional economic development. Today, we are fortunate to have Professor Carayannis back to deliver a second talk titled Digital Transformation, Industry and Society 5.0, PIT Challenges and Opportunities. Welcome, Professor Elias Carayannis, to the Public Interest Technology Colloquium.
Thank you so much, Roba, and all. Thank you for your presence and time. Let me share a screen. As I said earlier, I hope to have an interactive discourse today rather than just more of a lecture slides-driven commentary. This is, let me enlarge this, see if we can. You can see my slides. Okay, 1 second, please. All right. So the theme remains democracy, environment, and technologies, and what it means, the interactions, and what it means for theory, policy, practice, and politics. Okay, and what I would like to go to, I will skip through slides with your indulgence. The points that I wanted to revisit and refer to begin with is, first of all, the what, going from digital to analog, not just digitalization or analog to digital, but from digital to analog transformation as needed and appropriate, seeking a balance between the techno and human-centric. And as I explained, this is about nuancing, allowing for nuances, and limiting or controlling the filtering out of the nuances that effectively the digitalization, the conversion of the analog into digital is. And so have a balance between techno and human-centric design theories, and then policies, practices, and politics. An example would be the digital currency adoption. There has been a broad adoption, almost complete transformation or transition to digital money in some countries. For instance, in Scandinavia, that has excluded older people. So from a public-private view perspective, this is not something to be taken lightly or ignored. Then, of course, we have issues that have to do with sustainability, green technologies, and whether and how we can have some kind of discussion as to what technologies are truly green and what are really not so much. A big question, for instance, is nuclear fusion, which is an open question. Very challenging currently because, of course, nuclear-powered generation of energy has been a rather unfortunate and unsuccessful to some extent endeavor, given the pitfalls, no pun intended here, viewed from a public interest technology perspective. The question is technology really developing? How has it developed and changed over time, locking our thinking into a certain mindset that may really look back and reflect only past experience, while that should not be ignored in any case, is also wrong. And this is really at the heart of managing risks. We need a more perhaps intelligent, more adaptive, more perhaps even technology enabled, public interest technology and AI for that matter enabled approach to check, assess, evaluate, and then monitor options like nuclear fusion, given what has been happening, for instance, in Europe and the pressure to effectively decouple from a major source of natural gas and go back to using coal or traditional even nuclear power generation. Fusion may be a best way forward that needs to be further explored, understood, and assessed. We have some work on that. The Industry 5.0 and Society 5.0 concepts I presented last time, I will refer to again, hopefully will be part of our discussion. This is the context, the framework within which many of the things I mentioned can fit in. They effectively emphasize a balance, whether it is the industry or the society perspective, a balance between human-centric and technocentric configurations and solutions. The helices or helical architectures, we'll get to that in a moment. The how or emerging unified theory of helical architectures is really trying to establish and understand how can we best design and maintain, implement and maintain ecosystems. We're operating on the assumption and basis that we have a systems approach that are interlinked components, and that is, in fact, in my mind at least, a big part of what public interest technologies are about. We do not operate or think in terms of isolated islands. We should be thinking and operating on the basis of at least archipelago or connected nodes, and that means effectively a network and a system of systems in that matter, and that also should imply that we are we should be thinking about ways and means that knowledge can best be generated, shared, absorbed, and used. This is where the helical architectures enter, in particular involving key stakeholders. They do not necessarily represent people, but they represent institutions as well as the environment. I'm talking about the quadruple and the quintuple innovation helix, the stakeholders there being government, university, industry, civil society, and the environment. And of course, they are 5 dimensions or intertwined, 5 strands or threads intertwined in a helical manner, because the interfaces, the knowledge interfaces for that matter, are optimized. The design and their presence, the location is optimized. If we have helical architectures, that's just simply learning from and emulating nature. And the question is, how can we keep improving on that? How can we ensure that there is as intelligent and sustainable and effective and efficient a conversation and collaboration across different sectors to make as fast and best progress as possible to get best in breed solutions regarding, for instance, environment remediation. Just today, something that we knew or we should have known, but it was again mentioned as part of the UN meetings and the World Bank and IMF meetings. In the last 50 years, 70% of natural life has disappeared. So that is a big issue and a major wake-up call. Great Barrier Reefs in Australia are one case in point, but there's many other issues with bees disappearing and effectively the soil itself becoming a scarce resource, not only in terms of quantity, but in terms of quality. The soil degradation means that we may simply need to both try to reverse that and then also then may have to figure out other ways to produce food. So I mean, these appear too mundane, perhaps, issues, but they are very real and clear and present threats. So the point is, how can we establish ways to get beyond partisan lock-in, have a process as has been established decades ago in political science of mutual partisan adjustment, effectively towards some consensus and convergence. The benefit of the doubt used to be taken for granted in most developed democracies. Now, populism and all the other challenges that I have referred to have made this, turned this on its head. And this is a big part of the challenge here and should be part of the consideration for designing public interest technology solutions. We've moved from the benefit of the doubt to the handicap of the doubt. In other words, people are mistrustful, cynical, and open to populist influences, and that is a big problem. We have then the implications, and I mentioned already the environmental degradation threats and the planetary warming is just one part of this. Developed democracies and the environment. I have labeled them endangered species about 2 years ago in an interview. This has been true for quite some time, but it is something we need to really recognize to begin a transformation of our mindsets and behaviors and engage, even though we may not consider ourselves as sort of militant advocates belonging to some kind of organization. We're all stakeholders on this planet, and we should figure out ways to engage and both demand and then facilitate the development of solutions rather than just allowing problems to emerge and mature and fester. So we should be more, and we should try to become more part of the problem, part of the solution, excuse me, and not the problem. If we stay inactive or passive, we'll inevitably and increasingly become part of the problem. Okay, so these are things that I have shared already. Are there any comments or questions at this point? And then I will discuss and come to a closure on my part, the points from the New Earth Initiative, and in brief mention the 2 use cases that I touched on before. Any questions at this point? If not, we can hold on and hopefully have more dialogue later on. Let me proceed. If that's the case, then the New Earth Initiative, I posted this on the webpage of one of my Journal of the Knowledge Economy some time ago. Again, this is a call to become more proactive in trying to reduce the Earth temperature, not just try to mitigate the increase rate of it, which is, of course, a welcome first step if achieved. In my mind, becoming and being more aggressive and more proactive may be necessary. I'm not sure if it will be sufficient, but certainly it's a necessary step forward. So the idea is to think of policies, practices, and then shape our politics to establish creative partnerships, public, private, people, planet partnerships, as I call them, to envision, first of all, and then enact prototype solutions. That may involve geoengineering approaches. Every technological intervention, every human act of this type has a Faustian aspect to it. Always there is downside risks as well as upside potential. But if, as I said before, we're at a point that we can't afford to just stay passive. So carbon capture technologies, as well as other types of intervention that simply establish ways to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, not just reduce the rate of release of such gases into the atmosphere, I think is a necessary step at this point. Geopolitics will inevitably remain sort of an elephant in the room. The different adversaries should figure out a way, being on the same planet, to engage constructively, and that may well be a way. Superarching goals and initiatives and collaborations may well be a way to develop more constructive relations among adversaries of traditional form. So I'm referring to the different global initiatives, whether US-driven, China-driven, or otherwise promoted, and propose and identify the need and opportunity to establish some ways to collaborate. That's not naive thinking. That is, I believe, more realistic thinking. And so then the use cases regarding the New Earth Initiative, for instance, is are examples that rely on technology. Certainly, in the end, these technologies, whether publicly or privately or in a form of public-private partnership developed, are public interest technologies. Cost-benefit analysis in terms of determining whether and how it's best to move forward with given alternative sources of energy generation, for instance, that would look at the as is and also the as should be and could be, and then use different new methodologies, AI, among other things, enabled regarding metrics, measurement, meaning monitoring and management approaches. So how you don't just find one stop shop solution that is simply the way forward, but actually realize, accept, and act on the basis that you have to be continually, incrementally adaptive and improving, hopefully. Then adopting and leveraging knowledge, innovation, entrepreneurship ecosystems. These are effectively modalities. They certainly build on the helices that we mentioned before. In essence, looking for ways and triggering, catalyzing, and accelerating growth that is smart, sustainable, and inclusive. Looking for ways that that whether it is universities or other sources of knowledge and innovation are enabled and incentivized to maximize the value added and do so for both private gain, but also public good. So that's an important part of our capacity to transform our world and our circumstances. Then in connection with that and in support of both points A and B is point C, which is reinventing in a way public policy as it relates to both fiscal, in fact, and monetary. And this is something that is slowly emerging. Nowadays, we see the need for that, actually, given the significant variability and the implications of both the actual changes, whether it is in prices, inflation, interest rates, but also expectations, which is the big factor and the big source of concern for policymakers, both fiscal and monetary. So the idea and the question is here, could we, instead of saying we set interest rates at this rate and we'll consider this again in a month or whenever, and of course, setting and managing expectations properly here is the essence of central bankers and other such policymakers. However, could it be possible to figure a way to have this on a much more dynamic basis that in itself would be self-corrective and self-organizing? That in itself could, in essence, filter out and push away speculation. So then, as I mentioned, geoengineering technologies, carbon capture technologies among them, on a global scale, an initiative to really develop renewable energy sources and technologies beyond what we have, and get the big countries and everybody else, in fact, to collaborate. This could be a major United Nations initiative. It's pretty ironic if you can consider that the United Nations was formed during, in fact, the Second World War as an effort by President Roosevelt and others, the allies at the time, to develop a framework for global collaboration and understanding to avoid future conflicts and wars. I think there is a real need for identifying and launching global initiatives in a way that actually will both capture the imagination of the individuals, the citizens, and also provide opportunity for benefit, credit, and therefore political survivability and sustainability to the leaders, to incentivize them to engage. So this could be one area. And then, of course, the European Union in that sense, in fact, would actually be sort of, if not the honest broker, a sort of a intermediary, having more soft power than other power, acting and connecting the other major powers and adversaries to bring them together to the table and identify initiatives to be framed and launched. Leadership is needed there. I hope that will emerge. And then finally, I mentioned these modalities: crowdsourcing, crowdstorming, crowd funding, which can well empower the individual to both have a say and then have a role, including in an investor sense, into these initiatives. Of course, again, transparency is critical to be maintained and assured. I was very saddened to learn yesterday through a BBC exploratory investigative journalism piece, how the Chinese platform TikTok actually has been exploiting the suffering of refugees in Syria to seek funding from people all over the world, crowdfunding, and then keep 70% of the monies, with a local facilitator taking another 10%, with less than 20% left for the actual people the monies was meant to go to. So this is, well, this is beyond tolerance and beneath contempt, as I would call it. And this is something that needs to be avoided at all costs. It doesn't mean that the technologies are inappropriate. The way we're using them is. So this, in a nutshell, is the set of challenges and opportunities I'd like to revisit. Brief comment on the innovators. Let me go further now to the use cases and conclude. I know I ended up taking a little bit longer, but that was to be expected, I'm sure. So first of all, this is how we design effective and efficient. This is very important, of course. Waste needs to be minimized, if not abolished. Waste, not just of resources, but perhaps even more importantly, of opportunities. And this is where the efficacious, effective, and efficient use of knowledge and the opportunities to both generate and then integrate and synthesize knowledge to produce higher order benefits and effects, starting with learning, is critical. And this is what these concepts are built around. First of all, the word scarce. Strategic knowledge, arbitrage, and serendipity is about exactly the two phenomena of knowledge, serendipity, and knowledge arbitrage that we have identified as key drivers and determinants of the level of effective efficiency, efficacy of an ecosystem, where knowledge is generated, shared, absorbed, and used. And innovation entrepreneurship ecosystem is exactly such a case in point, whether it is the Silicon Valley or Boston area in the US, well-known, mature such cases. But there are many parts around the world where a lot of public monies and public interest technologies are being used and invested to help create, engender such environments, such ecosystems. In most cases, there is failure. And the reason for that, in my mind, in our opinion, and per our research, is that there is, there's a gap, there's a deficit in maturity in the ecosystem. The level of efficacy is too low. And what happens then, there is speculation. Private investors are happy to effectively take a very small amount of risk, leveraging primarily on public funds, and entrepreneurs, in essence, eschew or shun such cases unless they feel they have grown mature enough to be promising enough. So there is a threshold and there's a critical mass challenge of maturity that is a proxy for efficacy. Okay, and so this is what we're referring to, and we've researched, we've modeled, we've used intelligent agents to simulate an operation in an ecosystem. We've compared, in fact, and we have identified cultural factors and differences, and Saxenian and others have referred to these things over the years between different locations geographically, people, culture, and technology. These are the circles shown in this multi-level and, as we say here, multi-layered, multilateral, multi-nodal construct. These are basically, this is a representation of an ecosystem that could be understood or perceived at the micro, meso, and macro levels. And then also in each level, we have bundles, combinations of people, culture, technology. They could be a company or teams or entire sectors or industries. The point being is that, and this is what I'm referring to, each of these small circles are effectively a combination of these other circles, which represent people, culture, and technology components. And it's a bundle in itself. Now, these have to be brought together in a way that is not just relying and building on resources, but also, as perhaps more importantly, on a culture of trust and respect and understanding, sharing openly and proactively, and sharing in a way that maximizes the likelihood for discovering serendipitously knowledge that is critical for you, haven't come across yet. You're not even looking for it, but your stakeholders, your fellow stakeholders in the ecosystem actually alert you to it. And then also having the capacity, wherewithal, experience, and perhaps even AI supported perception to understand how best to use it. I'm talking about lateral use applications, for instance, and this is the knowledge arbitrage path. So you have knowledge serendipity and knowledge arbitrage, where that could be applied, and also with a public interest technology perspective in mind, is leveraging digital technologies, building solutions, following the helical architectures, and targeting and assisting displaced people. Of course, I have been talking about the environment, but this is in some regards an important part of it too, and it's a priority, displaced both internally and externally. This is not to refer to only to people coming from another country, but perhaps there could be ways to engage both types of displaced individuals to provide opportunities for them. And then there are other concepts I have referred to last time. Let me move on to the end of this, and then move to the second use case. I'm mindful of the time. This is how this could actually, one way to develop solutions and even commercialize them in this manner. And this is a classic approach in terms of piloting, prototyping, testing, and then validating and commercializing. The important descriptor of our research related to the role, important significance of the degree of maturity of an ecosystem as to whether and how it is sustainable, whether and how it is effective and efficient enough in its use of resources to provide and produce benefits and results, is shown here. And this is a sort of a type of hockey stick curve that actually shows the inflection point, in effect, represents the point where critical mass of maturity is attained. Up to that point, people, the key stakeholders and other potential participants are not convinced that if they engage, they will benefit more than they will have to invest in. That certainly applies to entrepreneurs and innovators. Beyond that, you pass that point, somehow word of mouth and other ways and means, social media and so forth, become a source of establishing that there is opportunity that is valid, reliable, and worth taking advantage of. And then you have, of course, an exponential growth effect. These are just some ways that we're using the intelligent agents study. We identified, as I said, ways and means that knowledge is used, and the happy accidents phenomenon, the discovery serendipitously of knowledge that is critical in its use. And that is just one component in designing and implementing, providing options, and then designing and implementing solutions based on the options you selected to act on. Now, we've been talking a lot about knowledge. Well, the source of knowledge, the major source of knowledge, the generator, the engine of knowledge are the universities, both in terms of knowledge that is disseminated and shared through teaching, and then also, of course, new knowledge that is created through research. We are proposing and discussing here something that I have been, as I mentioned in the previous discussion, Michael Crow's, president of the ASU's, ideas that I came across 15 some years ago were certainly a strong influence. And then beyond that, I've developed some ideas that relate to what I call the fractal research, education, innovation ecosystem. In a way, it's reinventing and truly going away from the university in its traditional form. This is this is, as a matter of fact, in reality, a medieval construct, starting with the religious institutions, monasteries that were teaching dogma, and still retains many aspects of all that. And the question is, can we envision a way and an approach like with the helical architectures, where instead of having a top-down structure, we actually have more of a balanced top-down and bottom-up, in fact, more bottom-up driven structure that is much more dynamic, whether it is about themes and areas of focus in terms of teaching and research, but also in terms of then transfer of the results and the commercialization of those is much more dynamic. It's connecting the different stakeholders much more openly and proactively. And this is why I'm talking about a fractal, self-similar research, education, and innovation ecosystem. So you have the different key areas of the university, and also empowering the third mission results, the outreach, getting out into the society and the economy. The universities in the quintuple helix construct, let me jump in, I apologize, bear with me, are represented at the heart of this, in fact, if I find this, are represented at the heart of the quintuple helix representation. The intent is to emphasize the significance of having this kind of role for the university. So universities are surrounded by governments. I can't find that now, I apologize, but that's, it was in this, should be in the slides. Universities and government, or industry rather, and then government, and then civil society, and then the environment, right? So then in closing, as far as universities go, can we use the universities also as facilitators, enablers of this balanced techno and human-centric approach that applies and connects to both industry and society 5.0. And the issue here is education is critical to inform and inspire and incentivize people to operate as, again, active citizens, stakeholders that are part of the solution, not the problem. Okay, that's it. I have some closing slides here I've shown before. I had some more I could have shared about the, for instance, an interesting case of a public interest technology that is really more about the dark side of this. I'm referring and thinking of a movie of some 25 years ago called Minority Report, where technology actually sort of was aware of who would be most likely to commit a crime, and people were arrested in advance of committing a crime. Prevention and preemption was more important than actual human rights and assumption of innocence and all that. We may well be on that, we may well be well on that way, on this path, in some countries at least, where there's social scoring, for instance. Okay, so questions, yeah. And I guess, I don't know, I see George Roussos, welcome from the audience. I'm finished, done with the slides. As I mentioned, I need to conclude around 2 p.m. I'll be happy to give some extra time. That means we got about 15-20 minutes. So please, hopefully there is questions and discussion. We will not have 20 minutes of awkward silence. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Elias Carayannis. I think I might take over here and pass on to my co-host, Professor Katina Michael, for some reflections, and then we'll come back to some questions for our audience. Please feel free to indicate if you wish to speak or place your questions in the chat while Katina is reflecting. Katina, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Roba. What a talk, Elias. We are presented with a view of public interest technology at scale. And I know scale has become a bit of a dirty word in some pockets in the world, almost like this notion of taking over things. But when we have these big ideas of how to make large scale change, we need to think at that level. But of course, as you reminded us in your first talk, all change is local. And I've heard President Crow say that so many times. And you also spoke to us about the glocal. But this top-down, bottom-up approach actually is what Elinor Ostrom used to talk about quite often, the Nobel Prize winner from the 2000s period, and her wonderful Ostrom and Ostrom work called The Workshop at Indiana University, and then at ASU for a short time. A bit of influence there in the School of Sustainability, which is part of the college that puts on this particular PIT event weekly. So this top-down, bottom-up is about being humble, but also knowing that these international organizations, these governance units that we're proposing to collaborate towards significant change in a co-design capacity actually rely on the people to make that change. And this is where the top-down, bottom-up happens. So people do things, they've been doing it for centuries in places. White collar comes in and says, we need this change, let's institute it because we know better. But in fact, neither knows better, they just know different. And this cross-pollinization that you've really talked to us about is what it's about. The locals know the local conditions, know the history, know the culture, know what kinds of processes, not so much shiny gadgetry, but the processes and procedures that have been done. And they can inform these new kinds of processes that are being imposed, perhaps by governance units or government agencies or regulators, where we come together and basically, as we stated, come to some kind of empowerment of one another. This takes coordination, as you mentioned, this takes collaboration, this takes this notion of an as is to be. I'm here today, but change is constant. If we look at the theory of change, how do we capture change? What is as is? Is it yesterday? Is it 5 years ago? Is it 20 years ago? And what's to be tomorrow, 10 years from now, 100 years from now? And what is the context? With that, I open up to you, the audience. We're so grateful that you're here. Some incredible brains in the audience today. I recognize all of you. And I just want to be quiet now and pass back to Roba and say again, thank you to Elias for that part 2. Part 1 will be available online. But Roba, back to you, as I know we have lots of questions and limited time.
Thank you so much, Katina. I might open to the floor before I ask any of my questions. Are there any immediate thoughts, questions, or reflections from our attendees? Again, thank you for attending, and we're delighted to have you here with us. Okay, so we've got one in the chat from Jumana Abu-Ghazali. Welcome, Jumana. Lovely to have you here with us. Thank you so much for a great talk. How do we account for differences in power across the helices? Great question. Over to you, Professor Carayannis.
Yeah, well, what do we mean differences in power? You mean institutional, executive, resource power, all of these? And why is that? Why this is important as a question? So I do that sometimes. I turn the question back to the source of it, especially my students appreciate that, I'm sure. But can you tell me again why exactly what you mean, and why is that an important question before I address it?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Sorry, Jumana, we can hear you. Can I get you to just briefly introduce yourself or Professor Carayannis before you go ahead and clarify that question?
Sure, of course. Thank you so much, Professor. My name is Jumana Abu-Ghazali, and I'm the founder of a nonprofit called Pivot for Humanity that is focused on professionalizing social technology. More on that later if you're interested, but that's the synopsis of who I am. My question is with regards to how the balance of power is distributed across the helices, and it's important because, for example, who speaks or acts on behalf of the environment, and how does it, there's a difference between actors and being acted upon. And it seems that the environment, for example, is a resource we continually use, but doesn't necessarily speak for itself until cataclysms or disasters. So how do we? I guess the question is this a model is a model a reflection of how things are, or a tool to shape how things should be? And if they should be, how do we establish a center of gravity that is equitable, I guess, across all helices?
Yeah, I just try to respond at least partly to this, and this is a very valid question. There's always room for well, abuse, but as I said already, passivity and inaction are probably worse options than trying to make a positive difference with the risk of triggering negative side effects and externalities. So what I mean is the environment, in my mind, and this is not, I think others have been proponents of this, the environment could and should be legally and institutionally recognized and represented, and therefore it shouldn't be just incumbent upon the goodwill and the courage and the sacrifice even of in specific NGOs to defend aspects of the environment's existence and in that sense, by extension, rights, or try to mitigate the negative impact on all of us as they're being abused and violated. The same goes for animals, of course. And the issue here is how can we identify both the benefits and the costs. This is really a cost-benefit analysis. It shouldn't be just only about our humanity and emotions and feeling better about environmental safeguarding or even animal rights protection. It should really be a realization that there are real, in some ways, or in many ways, tangible and quantifiable costs and benefits depending on how we choose to act. And the costs of, again, wrong behavior and action should be increased and enhanced and made better understood through means appropriate within the democratic process and discourse on all levels, including legal, as I mentioned. As far as so I don't know if I addressed the question. There's some more Jason comments here. Just a second, please, before I get to that. This is the use, in my mind, the validity and utility of the helices and the helical approach is that it may help identify areas where interests may both converge but also conflict across the different key stakeholders, and start the thinking and the process of discovery and exploration of best ways forward, best ways to establish win-win-win configurations, and getting beyond, and that's, I referred to partisan mutual adjustment before. And this should be embedded, institutionalized, enacted, and adopted as broadly and as profoundly as possible, because there's always opportunities for disruption, opportunities where fear, greed, and other instincts take over. And of course, when you have actual war, I mean, coming to Jason's comments, diplomacy and war are two sides of the same coin. I think, as Clausewitz said, that war is diplomacy by other means. We may be witnessing that as we speak. Now, the point is, I mean, I absolutely agree that a valueless any type of valueless education is simply dangerous. In fact, it's not just useless or counterproductive, it is dangerous, because you empower people to, you give them tools and ways and means to have bigger impact without necessarily having the concerns, considerations, and constraints of values. At the end of my presentation, I had a slide, two quotes from Plato about the need for kings to be philosophers So leaders need to have themselves, first of all, a profound grounding in values, including democracy and its implications. And the other is how everything is interconnected, a systems approach and perspective that goes and connects with what I just said. So when you pollute the environment, you're violating basic human rights, especially of those with lesser means to mitigate the impact. And yes, so that is huge issue. So civic education should not be just, I mean, it used to be much more widely and significantly recognized. And the other sad thing is that, you know, of course, clearly there are many sources and ways and means to recognize and benefit from ideas and values and knowledge. But as I mentioned before, there can be actually less successful, let's say, less productive and constructive ways to drive your points and your and claim your rights. And I'm talking about a sort of political correctness that has led to talking about you know, old white men and referring to, or ancient, referring to the ancients, the you know, the ancestors of ours that actually have actually been the source of insights, including Plato. So in some universities in the US, they have been en masse rejected, so as to make a point that there needs to be, as there is, a need for more inclusiveness. This is not just about the elders, and that's important too, that you mentioned, but also, you know, I was reflecting on the interviews and the comments that Elon Musk shared recently, and he was saying that, you know, the billionaires are much more effective and efficient in that sense, stewards of capital. That may be true up to a point. We know well, and if any one of their stories and evolutionary paths are studied truly and transparently, we will discover a lot of both serendipity, but also arbitrage opportunities. So they had, of course, the talent and insight to identify opportunities. But even Musk himself, he would have gone bankrupt perhaps more than once a few years back if the US government had not bailed him out. So the point is that, you know, we need imagination. We also need courage and humility in this process. And so the elders, the billionaires, could be a community that needs to recognize, exactly because of their control of so much capital, that they have a public interest, responsibility, and obligation to act as stewards of the public interest, and become an NGO that actually, in a sense, that actually provides input, but in a transparent way, and in a way that is not maximizing or pursuing their own self-interest. So that is a very important thing. Otherwise, yes, the role of elders is critical. But again, as you mentioned, should be beyond politics. Okay, I agree with that. This is very important. By the way, the letters BP years ago with the tragedy in the Gulf with the BP Horizon catastrophe, and there's been many others. Unfortunately, I used to talk about British pollution standing for BP, but that's also beyond politics. Another way to use the letter. So, any other questions here?
I think Professor Carayannis, I might call on Jason for any follow-ups or any comments that you'd like to make, Jason. I know you have a hard stop, is that correct, Elias?
Yeah, we have, let's say, another 10 minutes, okay? So we
Perfect. Excellent. So Jason, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Roba. Can you hear me okay?
I can, and I might ask you for a brief intro as well, Jason, for those who don't know you. Thank you.
Professor, it's an honor to just sit here and listen. a lot of what you've talked about. I've written copious notes, 3 pages, I think. I've just asked my department chair, Professor Mile Terziowski, to join us. You've already spoken, and I said, quick, jump in quick. Otherwise, I'll get the recording for him, because this is
Thank
what
you,
we tried
Jason.
it. Mile's here, so that's good. So a lot of the things, Elias, that you're talking about. So diplomacy is important, I think, but I've never been taught diplomacy.
I'm sorry, professor of what and where? And you also, if you would you please?
Yeah, sorry. So we're at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne. We've got a new vision and mission to put people and technology together for a better world. And I've sort of been doing that for the last 20 years or so. I've did my PhD on the Thai-Burma border, looking at refugee education, and I teach professional issues in IT, everything from ethics, privacy, wicked problems, COP, social capital, JEDI type stuff, to undergrads and some masters. And I take a small group of students over to remote India. So when I get into those environments, nobody taught me how to be diplomatic and to, to be able to step through those often minefields that you have with those clients or people you work with. Some of them I would consider family, they're that close to me. The digitally illiterate, I think, is another important part of the mix that we need to think about working in public interest technology. But you were talking about the UN, and that got me thinking that maybe it's not the billionaires, it's maybe these elders, more statespersons, people like the Mandelas were, who are maybe one step away, who can be almost like a conscience and influencer to the billionaires to remind them the way to go, like translators. And then with the UN, I was trying to think, what is the antithesis of the mutually assured destruction? Whatever that is, that's what I think we as public interest technologists are trying to do, and we can get that through, I think, your bullet point E that you were talking about with the UN and the European Union. So lots and lots of follow-ups, so I'll probably be in touch, but just thank you for touching on all those points, and any feedback or follow-ups from those.
Yeah.
Sure.
Let me mention 2 things. Of course, I will welcome. In fact, feel free to share your notes and annotate them if you want with questions or comments, and I'll try to respond. But first of all, we need to, as I said, reinvent the UN. The reality is that, and there is a lot of criticism, and during the years that I spent working near the University of George Washington, but also with the World Bank and so forth. The reality is that these are institutions and organizations that were formed by Western democracies at the end of the Second World War, and there was significant positive, let's say, and even altruistic intent, but the reality is that there are other aspects of those, okay? And they're perceived as means of perpetuating and promoting a certain perspective. And of course, we know about the Washington Consensus imposing liberal approaches and structures on countries, often with short-term, at least, negative effects, even though the long-term intent was much more, again, I would say, I want to believe, well-intentioned. In any case, there are a lot has been learned, or should have been. A lot of more wisdom is available and should be used in terms of how we design our interventions. In my slides and comments last time and today, I briefly touched on these things. There's a lot more in terms of designing leapfrogging strategies and trade-offs, moving from natural scarcity to artificial abundance, leveraging technology, ensuring that we don't end up with more scarcity than abundance. And yeah, so the issue of equity, there's tremendous gaps, tremendous divides. You talked about India, I mentioned Syria, and if someone really understands what's going on there, it's amazing that a lot more in terms of reactions, negative reactions, I mean, including violent reactions, have not been taking place. And I think we need to both reinvent, perhaps recreate a proper global structure, and that's where all kinds of groups with social, human, intellectual, and financial capital resources need to come into play in place. So the billionaires, but also others, the NGOs, somehow we need to figure out ways, and there needs to be, in my opinion, and I hope there will be leaders from its group that will figure out a way to establish a global connection to actually identify and formulate priorities. Things like the World Economic Forum and so forth have really been initiatives that aimed to promote specific views and operate in a specific way, not necessarily for the planet or for the public, in my mind. And inevitably they've become marginalized. So this is a big, the challenging times we live in are also times of great opportunity, in my opinion, and I want to believe. I don't want to become sort of a pessimist. So any other comments? Thank you, Jason, for your input. And I welcome, of course, your professor too. Any other comments?
Do we have any other comments from the floor? I might end, Professor Carayannis, with one of my own, tying to the theme of this series, our fourth series of the PIC colloquium, and really touching on a lot of the, I guess, concepts that you spoke about. So you mentioned as part of your talk, did this talk and the previous, the key to all of this is stakeholders, so collaboration across sectors, and so much more tied to that notion. We feel that transdisciplinarity and establishment of the appropriate transdisciplinary frameworks is key here, in addition to the integration of co-design as part of that transdisciplinary approach. And we know as part of your work and as part of our readings that you've used a lot of these co-words. So you've used coexistence, you mentioned co-evolution, co-specialization, competition, and so on. Do you have any ready thoughts as to the value of adding co-design to those co-words? And also, what do you see as some of the potential challenges in encouraging a transdisciplinary approach? There are many documented, I guess, criticisms of transdisciplinarity. Any thoughts on either the co-design approach or transdisciplinarity, just to wrap up this session?
Sure, of course, and thank you. And it's a very good question to come to close for today. I definitely welcome input going forward. I shared my email and be happy to also engage online if there is an opportunity. Look, I think transdisciplinarity, co-design is inherently intrinsic in all of these other co-words, starting with co-evolution, co-specialization, co-opetition. They all imply and in effect define co-design, if you think about it, right? So co-design does not need to be added, it's already there. If one really starts truly understanding what we're talking about, because this is how nature, in fact, redesigns and reinvents and the evolution of the species itself. If you think about it, it's co-design, co-opetition, co-evolution, co-specialization, and then, of course, in the process, the emergence of more viable solutions from a natural perspective. The other word, transdisciplinarity, that also in my mind, this is about thinking, as I say, beyond the box, not just trying to be incrementally creative, but truly radically transformative. This is a difference between thinking outside the box and beyond the box. Establishing freedom in your envisioning and your thinking, without, of course, forgetting knowledge and experience, but allowing your intuition and your imagination to express themselves. And that's really essentially transdisciplinarity. So in my mind, even those who criticize it actually are practicing it in a way without realizing it. Now, I don't mean to sound like some sort of a cult voice here talking about this, but the point is, how do we get beyond our biases, our grounded perspectives that are embedded in our even DNA, and how do we learn to, as I said, become overall, co-evolve as a species, and as you use the word, co-design our solutions going forward. So this is, if you go back, and I'll close with that, a reference to the text I have posted on the Journal of the Knowledge Economy webpage, the New Earth Initiative. I really think that is a call that could be hopefully used as a frame of reference and a parting point of departure for co-design actions and initiatives, and in a transdisciplinary, transformative way. I hope this comes to be, and I certainly am encouraged by the presence of your hospitality and recognition, you and Professor Michael, and of course, all the others here.
Thank you so much, Professor. And what a lovely way to end this session. We do recognize that we're out of time with you, Professor Elias Carayannis. A big thank you for joining us today, and also for your many contributions, both your academic contributions and those specifically to the 4th series of our Public Interest Technology Colloquium. It's certainly going to be very valuable to debrief post this talk and to move forward with some of these ideas that you've suggested, that you've identified, in order to consider both those challenges and opportunities. You also mentioned the word balance, which is so very important, and you so eloquently identified and explored so many aspects and ideas that we really need to think deeply about during both of your talks. For our live attendees, thank you so much for joining us for this session, and we welcome, as Professor Carayannis said, further discussion and dialogue. Professor Carayannis has placed his email in the chat, and Katina and I would be interested to further this discussion with you. So if you are interested in finding out more, contributing to, or joining us as we work toward this vision or shared vision for transdisciplinarity in the public interest, please get in touch. And finally, if you would like to revisit this talk or the first delivered by Professor Carayannis, the recordings will be made available on Arizona State University's School for the Future of Innovation in Society YouTube channel, and we'll also be placing these on IEEE TV. You'll also be able to access on these channels other sessions from series 1 through to 4 of the colloquium. And as always, and on behalf of myself and my co-host, Professor Katina Michael, we'd like to thank you for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session of series 4 of the PIT colloquium. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Bye now.
You.